The propaganda films had prepared her for savagery. Standing on the dusty ground of Texas, feeling the oppressive heat press against her skin, the 22-year-old medical auxiliary from Osaka tried to steady her breathing. Other women surrounded her, clutching whatever meager belongings they'd managed to keep through the chaos of surrender and transport. Their eyes moved constantly, searching the faces of the American sentries posted at the facility's entrance, looking for signs of what was to come. Everything she'd been taught suggested this moment would bring humiliation at best, violence at worst. The enemy soldiers were supposed to be undisciplined creatures, men who saw captured women as nothing more than prizes to be claimed. Her muscles tensed involuntarily, preparing for shouted insults, rough hands, or the kind of degradation that had been described in whispered warnings back home. What she encountered instead left her momentarily confused. The American guards maintained rigid postures, standing with their weapons held vertically, their expressions revealing absolutely nothing beyond professional attention to duty. They were taller than she'd expected, clearly well-nourished in a way that suggested their nation's abundance, wearing uniforms that showed careful maintenance. Not one of them leered or smirked. Not one called out crude remarks. They simply stood there, observing with the detached focus of men performing an ordinary assignment. An officer emerged from somewhere behind the wire, accompanied by someone who spoke her language. The interpreter's voice cut through the anxious silence, delivering instructions in clipped Japanese. "Arrange yourselves in 2 columns." The command was simple, direct, devoid of mockery or menace. The women complied, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, still anticipating the moment when American soldiers would reveal their true nature. That moment never arrived. Inside the processing area, medical personnel waited with documentation materials spread across tables. Each woman's personal information was systematically recorded. Names were written down, ages noted, unit assignments logged. Identification materials were distributed. Rules governing camp life were methodically explained through the translator, who repeated each regulation twice to ensure comprehension. American military personnel are prohibited from fraternizing with prisoners of war. Personal interactions beyond official duties are forbidden under any circumstances. No special treatment will be given. These policies derive from international agreements governing the treatment of captured combatants. The Japanese words hung in the air like something incomprehensible. Several women exchanged glances of pure bewilderment. They had steeled themselves against unwanted advances, against the possibility of being forced into compromising situations through coercion or bribery. Instead, they were being informed that strict barriers separated them from the very guards they'd feared, barriers enforced by military law and international convention. Medical examinations proceeded with clinical efficiency. Wounds received during combat or capture were cleaned and bandaged without ceremony. Temperatures were checked, vaccination histories reviewed, basic health assessments completed. The American medics maintained professional boundaries throughout every interaction. They wore protective gloves, communicated through interpreters when necessary, and moved from one patient to the next without lingering unnecessarily or making inappropriate contact. She sat rigid on a wooden bench while an American medical corpsman wrapped her injured wrist in fresh gauze. He worked quickly, his gloved hands performing the task with practiced competence, speaking only to the interpreter about the injury's severity. When finished, he moved immediately to the next person requiring attention, never once meeting her eyes directly. This wasn't the coldness of contempt or hatred. This was the impersonal efficiency of established procedure, the kind of detached courtesy she'd never imagined possible from soldiers she'd been taught to consider barbaric. Near the tent's far wall, a large notice displayed text in both English and Japanese characters. Personal contact between United States military personnel and prisoners of war is strictly prohibited. All prisoner requests must be submitted through official camp administration channels. She stared at those words, trying to reconcile them with everything she'd been told about American soldiers during her training. This wasn't indulgence or cruelty. This was something else entirely, a refusal to cross boundaries she'd assumed didn't exist in the chaos of war. As she followed the line of women toward the barracks buildings, understanding began to dawn slowly. Whatever this place represented, whatever happened here, it operated according to rules that apparently superseded individual desires or impulses. That realization proved more disorienting than any insult or threat could have been. The housing structures were simple wooden constructions arranged in precise geometric patterns behind multiple rows of wire fencing. Stepping inside, she noticed how sunlight filtered through elevated windows, illuminating rows of metal frame beds equipped with thin mattresses. The women had anticipated cell-like conditions, cramped quarters designed for maximum discomfort. What they discovered was order. Beds positioned with careful spacing, blankets already folded, storage lockers labelled with numerical designations, regulations posted prominently in both languages. 2 female interpreters wearing Women's Army Corps uniforms stood ready to explain camp operations. They distributed clothing items, towels, and printed schedules detailing daily routines. Morning meal at 600 hours, roll call at 700 hours, lights extinguished at 2100 hours. Unauthorized communication with guards is forbidden. Each line reinforced the same fundamental message. Boundaries existed, discipline prevailed, predictability governed everything. Initially, the women spoke among themselves in hushed voices, sharing speculations and suspicions. Some had believed American guards would attempt to trade minor privileges for cooperation or favors. Others had imagined nighttime intrusions, whispered threats delivered when darkness concealed actions from official scrutiny. None of their expectations materialized. The guards outside maintained patrol patterns with mechanical regularity. Inside the barracks, no soldier entered without explicit permission from female interpreters. Meals arrived on wheeled carts, delivered by kitchen personnel rather than guards. When nervousness caused one woman to accidentally spill her soup, a civilian worker provided a replacement without comment or reproach. She sat on her assigned bed, holding the printed regulations document, trying to process what she was experiencing. "This seems impossible," she murmured to the woman in the next bunk. "They're treating us the way hospital staff treat patients." Yet tension didn't evaporate immediately. Some prisoners maintained their suspicions, wondering if this was merely an elaborate deception designed to lower their defenses. Perhaps the Americans were waiting for the right moment to reveal their true intentions. Days began establishing consistent patterns. Inspections were conducted briefly and impersonally. Supply distributions occurred at identical intervals each week. Medical examinations followed routine schedules and were conducted by female staff whenever possible. Not once did a guard violate the boundaries of professional conduct. Their expressions remained polite but neutral, their interactions governed entirely by duty and regulation, as though they wore invisible masks constructed from pure discipline. One evening, a guard walked past the area where women were hanging laundry to dry. He deliberately averted his gaze, keeping his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, as though the prisoners were completely invisible. The gesture stunned them more profoundly than any stare would have. She wrote in the small diary she'd begun keeping, commenting on the strangeness of their situation. "They refuse to look at us. They refuse to speak unless duty absolutely requires it. We exist for them only as paperwork and procedures." This revelation struck harder than cruelty would have. They were captives, certainly, held against their will behind wire and armed guards. But they were also subjects of a system that adamantly refused to blur the lines between captor and captive. For women raised in a culture where power often manifested through personal domination, this rejection represented its own form of profound shock. Time continued passing, and the rhythms of confinement became almost automatic in their regularity. Each morning during roll call, the women assembled in formation, counted themselves off in order, and returned to their barracks without any deviation from protocol. The predictability gradually eroded their initial fear. No nighttime raids occurred, no intrusive inspections violated their privacy, no secret punishments were administered. Instead, order prevailed, paperwork accumulated, schedules were maintained with unwavering consistency. A bulletin board appeared near the dining facility, displaying notices in both languages. It listed work assignments, mail collection times, and included a small printed reminder that any questions should be directed to authorized interpreters. It was there that she first witnessed an American guard kneeling to help a prisoner who'd stumbled and fallen. He assisted her in rising without making any other physical contact, without speaking beyond the minimum necessary words, then stepped back and returned to his assigned position. The simplicity of the action was startling. He didn't smile or attempt friendliness. He didn't linger or create any opportunity for personal connection. He performed a duty as defined by regulations and immediately resumed his normal responsibilities. Some prisoners began recognizing that the guards operated within a comprehensive system, following strict rules that governed even acts of basic kindness. Assistance was provided as a matter of institutional policy, not as personal favor that might create obligation or debt. When male privileges were announced, the women received blank paper and were informed they could write to their families. This too came with explicit rules. No specific details about camp layout or security measures could be included. No coded messages would be tolerated. Every letter would undergo censorship before being forwarded. Still, the mere possibility of communicating with loved ones felt like a crack appearing in the wall separating them from their previous lives. She stared at the empty page for an extended period before finally writing simply that she remained alive and that they were being treated according to established rules. Around her, other women composed similar brief messages, their hands trembling slightly as though afraid the very act of writing might somehow be punished despite permission having been granted. But no punishment materialized. Gradually, an unexpected emotion began surfacing among the prisoners. Relief. These soldiers were not friends or allies, but they were not predators either. One evening, as the sun descended behind the wire fencing, the prisoners noticed the guards withdrawing to their own separate quarters rather than maintaining any presence near the barracks. The boundary was absolute and apparently non-negotiable. She whispered to the woman in the next bunk, remarking that the soldiers would not cross the invisible line, separating captor from captive. It was like a wall made of glass existed between the two groups. Her companion nodded slowly, still uncertain whether to feel safer or more unsettled by this realization. The concept of American soldiers actively rejecting even simple friendly interaction challenged everything they'd been taught about the enemy and about how power functioned in military contexts. This wasn't indulgence or weakness. This was discipline maintained through conscious choice. Within that discipline existed an unexpected form of dignity, a strange variety of respect that manifested through deliberate refusal rather than through engagement. The camp's regulatory documentation became almost as familiar to the prisoners as their own personal histories. It was read aloud twice weekly through interpreters, its pages showing wear from constant handling and reference. No gifts may be accepted or given, no special favors will be granted. No conversations beyond those required by duty are permitted. These words were repeated until both guards and prisoners had them thoroughly memorized. Initially, it had sounded like a barrier designed to dehumanize and isolate. Over time, it began sounding like protection, like a structure built to prevent exploitation. In the barracks, whispered conversations evolved into cautious analytical discussions. Women wondered aloud why American soldiers maintained such rigid behavior. Was it rooted in fear of consequences? Was it contempt disguised as formality? Or did it represent something else entirely, something their own military culture hadn't prepared them to understand? She overheard two guards conversing outside one evening. They spoke in low English tones, but the interpreter later explained the substance of their conversation. Fraternization with prisoners of war is absolutely forbidden. Any violation results in court-martial proceedings. That revelation spread rapidly through the barracks like wildfire. This wasn't merely politeness or personal preference. This was military law. The Americans had bound themselves to rules as tightly as the prisoners were bound by wire fences and armed supervision. During meals, the separation became visually obvious. Guards ate at their own designated tables positioned far across the dining facility, their backs turned toward the prisoner sections. Prisoners lined up under civilian staff supervision, received their food, and returned to their seats without a single word being exchanged with military personnel. One afternoon, a small group of women attempted to present hand-sewn armbands to a guard as an expression of gratitude for medical supplies that had been provided. He refused immediately, stepping backward and signaling to the interpreter to explain camp policy once again. The refusal left them somewhat stunned. In their cultural context, gifts served as a mechanism for building relationships of mutual obligation, for securing protection through creating personal connections. Here, such gestures were meaningless and actually prohibited. For the first time, the women began perceiving the Americans not as potential tormentors or potential protectors, but as functionaries operating within an enormous bureaucratic system. She began recording her observations in her diary, noting that the American rejection felt like encountering steel. They neither demonstrate hatred nor express desire. They simply perform their assigned work and then vanish from view. This pattern of systematic rejection produced an unexpected effect on the prisoners. Instead of feeling vulnerable to predation, the women began experiencing a peculiar sense of safety. They felt secure inside walls constructed from discipline they didn't fully comprehend but could increasingly predict. At night, the camp settled into predictable quiet. Guards maintained their patrols silently. Lights were extinguished at identical times each evening. Even the footsteps of the sentries marking their rounds created rhythmic patterns like a metronome measuring time. It was within that steadiness that fear gradually began receding. They still maintained their mistrust and harbored doubts, but the consistent rhythm of professional refusal created an unexpected sense of order and stability. What had been rumors circulating back home about American soldiers engaging in mockery, harassment, or worse began crumbling. The myth of certain dishonor following capture dissolved not through acts of kindness, but through the maintenance of impersonal structure. By the third week of confinement, the camp's operational routines had become thoroughly internalized and automatic. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals, periodic inspections. Yet beneath the surface of acceptance, a different kind of tension flickered. The women had physically adjusted to adequate food, comfortable beds, and clean clothing, but their minds struggled to reconcile this reality with their previous understanding of the world. Some had begun testing the boundaries of the regulations, curious about the men who maintained such distance while guarding them. She noticed how one particular guard always paused briefly near the medical facility. He didn't speak or stare, but his presence lingered like an unanswered question suspended in the air. She wondered whether he might someday speak beyond issuing orders, or whether his silence represented a permanent condition. One afternoon, she deliberately thanked him in her limited English for delivering medical bandages. He responded only with a single brief nod before walking away without further acknowledgement. This rejection startled her more profoundly than any act of cruelty could have. It was clean, impersonal, absolutely unassailable in its finality. Throughout the barracks, whispered speculation increased. Some women theorized that the Americans were forbidden by their own commanding officers from any personal interaction. Others insisted the guards were merely waiting for an opportune moment to reveal their true intentions and nature. But the observable truth remained unchanged. Day after day, week after week, no boundaries were crossed. When guards delivered supplies, they conducted the transaction entirely through interpreters. When injuries occurred requiring treatment, female medical personnel handled them whenever possible. The pattern began creating a paradox in the prisoners' minds. The women, once terrified of assault and exploitation, now found themselves puzzling over why the soldiers maintained such extreme distance. During meals, the prisoners could observe guards laughing and conversing among themselves at distant tables, but never engaging with the captives. The separation was an invisible wall constructed from orders and military legal codes. For women raised in a culture where hierarchical power often blurred into personal control, this deliberate separation felt profoundly alien and difficult to comprehend. "They are like shadows carrying rifles," one woman whispered to her companions. She recorded in her diary her evolving understanding of the situation. "I expected to encounter monsters. Instead, I have found ghosts made entirely of discipline." The phrase circulated quietly through the barracks like a secret code shared among those trying to make sense of their circumstances. Yet even as distance continued defining all interactions, the prisoners began sensing something additional beneath the surface, a quality of reluctance. The American refusal of intimacy seemed less like contempt than like deliberate restraint being consciously maintained. Some women admitted privately among themselves that this restraint actually felt safer than any kindness or friendliness could have. "Better to have a wall between us," one observed, "than to have what appears to be friendship but might actually be a trap." Heads nodded in agreement around her bunk, and so the camp continued settling into its new equilibrium. No intimacy existed, no special favours were granted, but equally no violations occurred. The initial shock of capture had faded into a sustained astonishment at being treated according to established rules and procedures. By the fourth week, camp authorities expanded the correspondence program. Each woman was permitted to write one letter every 14 days, with contents inspected by censors but otherwise transmitted unaltered. Stacks of envelopes appeared on the dining tables. The interpreter explained proper addressing procedures, how to sign names legibly in both writing systems. The act felt almost ceremonial in its significance, like being momentarily reconnected to a world that still existed beyond the wire. She stared at her blank page for an extended period, unable to decide what information to convey. Then she wrote with careful deliberation that she remained alive and that they were being treated according to regulations. Around her, other women composed similar notes, each letter representing a small confession being sent to families still living under rationing and propaganda back home. The correspondence program gave the camp a new quality of energy and purpose. Women traded paper for pencils, asked interpreters how best to phrase certain sentences, even dared to describe the quality of meals or medical care they were receiving. Yet they also hesitated, second-guessing their words. Some letters were torn up and rewritten multiple times after reconsideration. Would their families believe what they described? Would censors delete portions of their messages? One evening, the interpreter returned carrying replies that had arrived, brief letters faintly written, somehow transported across thousands of miles of ocean. Some of the women cried silently while clutching the envelopes against their chests. Those replies contained desperate questions. Is it actually true? Are you really alive and unharmed? Do they provide you with adequate food? For the first time, the women recognized how their captivity could carry not only personal shame, but also tremendous relief for loved ones who had feared them dead. She noticed her own written tone gradually changing. She no longer wrote exclusively about fear or confusion. She wrote about daily routines, about learning a few basic English words, about the surprising quietness of the nights. And she noticed something else emerging from the pattern. The Americans enforced the correspondence rules with the same strictness they applied to everything else. No personal notes could be included for guards. No thank you gifts could be attached to letters. The separation remained absolutely complete and non-negotiable. This refusal to blur the lines between captor and captive gradually created an unexpected form of respect in the prisoners' minds. The Americans were not attempting to win hearts or create friendly feelings. They were simply following regulations with absolute consistency. The women began understanding that the guards' rejection of familiarity was not an insult or expression of contempt, but rather part of a comprehensive system designed to prevent both sides from crossing boundaries that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. At night, rereading her letter to herself, she wrote in her diary about her evolving perception. They will not accept gifts, nor acts of kindness, nor any form of closeness. Perhaps that systematic refusal is precisely why I can sleep without fear now. For the first time since her capture and transport, she fell asleep before the scheduled lights-out time. Her breathing was steady and regular, no longer consciously waiting for some unseen cruelty to finally manifest. By midsummer's arrival, the camp had settled into rhythms that felt almost mechanical in their consistency. Wake-up call at dawn, breakfast service, assigned work details, meal hour, lights extinguished. The pervasive fear characterizing the early days had faded into cautious but stable routine. The women began organizing themselves within the barracks according to their own preferences and capabilities. Some took responsibility for cleaning duties. Others taught basic literacy skills to those who had never received formal education. Even within captivity, small hierarchies and friendships naturally emerged. They still half expected the rules to suddenly break down at any moment. Yet the American soldiers never deviated from their patterns. They maintained their distance consistently, always polite in their impersonal way, always firm in enforcing boundaries. Discipline had been transformed into a daily wall that both separated and protected. One morning she observed a guard issuing instructions to a group of newly arrived prisoners. His vocal tone was clipped and businesslike, but contained no cruelty or mockery. He gestured toward the rules posted prominently on the wall, then stepped back, leaving the interpreter to handle detailed explanations. She realized she had not witnessed a single guard raise his voice in anger during the past several weeks. Not one instance of physical discipline, not one verbal threat. Instead, everything was accomplished through established procedure and systematic process. This consistency gradually eroded her fear and suspicion. Some women found the routine unbearable in its monotony. Others discovered it strangely comforting in its predictability. The consistent pattern meant they could plan their days, could anticipate what would happen next, could gradually stop living in constant fear of sudden violence. Some took up small hobbies permitted under camp rules, like sewing or sketching. The low murmur of American voices outside the barracks became background noise, no longer automatically perceived as threatening. Letters continued arriving periodically from Japan. Some brought hope and news of survival. Others brought heartbreak and reports of loss. But each letter served to anchor the women to their past lives, even as their present circumstances reshaped their fundamental beliefs about the world. And with each passing day, they observed more clearly how firmly the Americans separated official duty from personal sentiment. No special favors, no unauthorized contact, no preferential treatment, not even for the seriously ill beyond proper medical care administered through official channels. She began perceiving the guards through a fundamentally different lens. They were not cruel men wielding power over helpless captives for personal gratification. They were soldiers obeying a comprehensive code that left minimal room for abuse, but equally left minimal room for any human connection. It was a paradox she still struggled to fully reconcile in her mind. How could people so careful, so thoroughly disciplined, so committed to proper procedure, also represent the enemy in whose name bombs had fallen on cities she had known and loved? She started sketching the camp layout in a small notebook she'd acquired. Rows of identical barracks buildings, guard towers positioned at regular intervals, the omnipresent barbed wire defining boundaries. She drew the guards as tall silhouettes without detailed features, faceless but orderly, like pillars supporting some invisible architecture of rules and regulations. It was through creating these sketches that she began understanding her own internal transformation. The drawings were no longer filled with symbols of fear and threat. They had become diagrams of a system, technical illustrations rather than nightmares made visible. By the 5th week, a subtle but profound transformation had established itself within the barracks. What had begun as pure disbelief had evolved into reluctant acceptance. What had started as paralyzing fear had become a complicated variety of respect. The women began talking openly during evening hours about the guards, no longer with fear dominating their discussions, but with genuine curiosity. Why were these men so thoroughly restrained in their behavior? Why did they function like machines of order rather than as men of conquest asserting dominance? Some compared them explicitly to the officers they had known back in Japan. "Our commanders were visible and loud," one woman observed. "These Americans disappear behind their regulations and procedures." Heads nodded in agreement throughout the dim barracks. She began noticing how even the smallest gestures followed established patterns. Guards stepping backward after completing supply distributions, refusing any gifts or tokens of appreciation, declining all attempts at small talk beyond what duty strictly required. It wasn't merely that rules existed, it was that an entire culture had been built around maintaining boundaries, a comprehensive system where soldiers protected not only the physical safety of captives, but also protected themselves from moral compromise and ethical violations. During afternoon work details, the women cleaned kitchen areas while American military police supervised from carefully maintained distances. No harsh words were spoken, no physical pushing or shoving occurred. When tasks were completed to satisfaction, the prisoners were sent back to barracks with simple nods of acknowledgement. For women raised within a military culture where hierarchy often blurred into ritualized humiliation, this impersonal consistency felt profoundly alien. Yet it also created a secret sense of safety they hadn't anticipated. At night, she thought about her family back home, about Japan itself and the life she'd known before the war. She wondered what her brothers would say if they could somehow see her current circumstances. Fed adequately, clothed properly, guarded by men who treated her according to rules and procedures rather than with fists or degradation. She found herself writing differently in the letters she composed. Instead of describing fear, she wrote about daily routines. Instead of recounting humiliation, she described order and systematic process. "They do not treat us as enemies to be degraded," she wrote in careful characters. "They treat us as obligations to be managed according to regulations." The letters underwent censorship but were still allowed to pass through to their destinations. Somewhere across thousands of miles of ocean, families read words that directly contradicted everything official propaganda had told them about American barbarity and lawlessness. Some women whispered among themselves that perhaps this discipline represented America's true source of strength in the war, not superior weapons or industrial capacity, but rather the ability to enforce boundaries and maintain order even when dealing with prisoners who could not resist or object. Others argued it was merely strategy, a calculated approach designed to gather intelligence or create propaganda showing American virtue. But even the most suspicious skeptics admitted they experienced less fear now than at any point since their capture and surrender. She began experiencing an unexpected internal shift. The American refusal of any intimacy or personal connection no longer felt like an insult or rejection of her humanity. It felt like proof that she existed as something beyond merely being an object of war, a thing to be used and discarded. In her diary, she wrote words that surprised her as they appeared on the page. "Their systematic refusal is a strange kind of respect I never expected. I do not fully understand why this feels something like freedom within captivity." Late summer evenings in the camp brought unexpected calm. Crickets sang outside the wire against the steady low hum of electrical generators, and the sky above transformed from deep red-orange to purple before fading into black darkness. Inside the barracks, women folded their blankets with precision that unconsciously mirrored the guards' own attention to proper procedure. Even those who had initially resisted the routines now moved according to the camp's rhythms, almost unconsciously, their bodies having internalized the schedule. They had anticipated that captivity would strip away their dignity and reduce them to humiliated wretches. Instead, it was teaching them a different variety of discipline entirely, one based not on fear of punishment, but on the comfort of predictability. She sat at her bunk one evening, writing yet another letter home. Her correspondence had grown progressively longer over the weeks. We are safe here. They refuse to cross the established lines. We work at assigned tasks. We eat adequately. We live from one day to the next, she wrote in her increasingly confident hand. For the first time since surrendering to American forces, she began allowing herself to plan for an actual future. Not a dramatic heroic escape or an honourable death, as propaganda had suggested, were the only options, but an ordinary future with days that would follow one another without terror defining each moment. The guards, for their part, maintained their professional distance with iron consistency that never wavered. No gifts accepted or given, no personal questions asked or answered, no favours granted outside official regulations. Some of the younger women had attempted during the early weeks to test these boundaries through subtle flirtations or carefully worded compliments. Every single time, the guards had responded identically, stepping back physically, redirecting the conversation through interpreters, or reporting the interaction to superior officers. It wasn't cruelty or anger. It was simply refusal that left absolutely no ambiguity about where lines existed. The women gradually came to understand that this too represented deliberate policy. The Americans would not risk violating their code for the sake of sentiment or personal feeling. Strangely, this consistent refusal began feeling like its own form of protection and safety. They no longer feared being singled out for exploitation or special attention. In refusing any closeness whatsoever, the guards had made every woman equally invisible in personal terms, and therefore equally protected by the system's impersonal rules. At night, she remembered clearly the officers she had served under in Japan before her capture. She remembered being slapped for minor infractions, being insulted for perceived failures, enduring long forced marches while suffering from fever, experiencing the casual humiliation of being treated as completely expendable and replaceable. The contrast with her current situation felt dizzying in its magnitude. She realized now that what she had once interpreted as strength, the cruelty and arbitrary exercise of power she'd witnessed, was actually only another form of weakness and lack of self-control. The Americans' restraint, frustrating and confusing as it could be, demanded a stronger form of discipline than violence had ever required. Some women whispered carefully among themselves that perhaps this explained why America was winning the war that had seemed unwinnable. Not because of superior weapons alone, but because of systematic organization and collective self-control. The idea felt dangerous to articulate openly, yet it spread quietly through nighttime conversations. She closed her diary for the evening. The guards' shadows passed along the exterior of the barracks like clock hands marking time's passage. She no longer trembled automatically at the sight of those moving silhouettes. She still didn't know how long her captivity would continue or what awaited her beyond the wire when the war finally ended. But she knew now, in a way she absolutely hadn't understood before, that she would survive this experience with her fundamental dignity intact. Autumn winds rattled the barbed wire fencing, scattering dried leaves across the camp's open yard. The harsh, glaring sunlight of midsummer had mellowed into something gentler, and the days progressively shortened as the season advanced. For the women living inside the barracks, time itself felt qualitatively different now. Not like serving a sentence with each day marked off toward some unknowable end, but like experiencing a natural season that would eventually give way to the next. She watched the guards during morning roll call with eyes that saw them differently than before. Their uniforms remained identical, their facial expressions equally neutral. But she now comprehended the underlying pattern, the meticulous checking of names against lists, the exact measured spacing of their steps during patrols, the deliberate way orders were delivered through proper channels. It was all component parts of a structure designed to keep chaos and randomness at bay. She no longer mistook this systematic approach for emotional coldness or personal rejection. She recognized it as the same discipline that prevented them from exploiting her vulnerability or taking advantage of her powerlessness. In her diary, she wrote observations that clarified her thinking. At first, their distance frightened me. Now I understand it as a wall deliberately built to keep both sides safe from each other. It represents the strangest form of kindness I have ever encountered in my life. Other women murmured similar realizations among themselves. They had progressed through stages from initial dread to confusion, then to grudging acceptance, and now towards something approaching actual relief. They could predict the guards' behavior with reasonable accuracy, and within that predictability they had discovered an unexpected variety of freedom from constant fear. One afternoon, during scheduled work detail in the vegetable garden area, the women were given extended time to tend plants they had sown weeks earlier. Small green shoots now stood where bare dirt had existed before, creating a living metaphor for their own gradual transformation. The guards remained positioned at distances, watching quietly without interference. No shouting occurred, no arbitrary interruptions disrupted the work. The women laboured in companionable silence, feeling genuine sunlight warming their faces, their hands working in actual soil. For brief moments, the war seemed impossibly far away from this small patch of earth. She thought again of her mother, of home, of a life that existed somewhere beyond uniforms and military salutes and the endless structures of organised violence. She did not yet know whether Japan would ultimately win or lose this war, but she knew with absolute certainty that the world she had been raised to believe in had developed irreparable cracks. At night, the barracks carried faint scents of soap and dried leaves brought in on clothing. Women whispered about what they might do after the war eventually ended. Return to nursing professions, open small shops, or simply disappear into ordinary family life away from military structures. They no longer whispered, as they once had, about dying with honour to avoid shame. The Americans' systematic rejection of any intimacy had accomplished something her own nation's army had never managed. It had forced her to perceive herself as an individual person, not merely as a functional component of a war machine designed to serve national purposes. She realized that her identity no longer depended fundamentally on how men perceived her or how officers judged her worth and utility. Her identity was being built from the small daily acts of survival she performed, folding a blanket properly, tending a growing plant, writing a letter to family, maintaining her own dignity through her own choices. The guard's flashlight beam swept across the barracks interior one final time before the scheduled lights-out hour. She met his eyes briefly through the window, and he looked away immediately as always, maintaining the required distance. In that tiny habitual gesture existed the entire story of her captivity compressed into a single moment. She lay down on her bunk, pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. She remained a prisoner, certainly, still far from home and family, still uncertain about the future. But the raw terror that had greeted her arrival in this place had completely evaporated. In its place existed a strange steadiness, a knowledge that she would eventually leave this camp as herself, fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered most. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind moving through the wire fencing. She no longer imagined rifles being aimed or punishments waiting at dawn's arrival. She imagined instead the sound of waves breaking on shores near her home, the bustle of a train station platform, her mother's voice calling her name in welcome.